Welcome students. This is the second class that we are having for Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I'm sorry, this is the third class. So we will just be continuing from the historical or the socio-historical context that we studied specifically, and then move on to the next issue that shall be at hand. So just a quick revision. We have discussed a bit about the social context or the history of slavery that this new country of America entailed, and a persevering history or a persevering culture that it maintained when it came to enslavement, when it came to keeping and perpetuating the keeping of slaves and continuing the system for generations, continuing the system of exploitation and oppression. So there were even though slavery was abolished constitutionally, there were black codes that came up in the southern states, which the abolitionists tried to remove. This was also the time when the Triple K or the Ku Klux Klan came to be. They were, who considered themselves to be racially superior, or to be very correct, they considered themselves to be the superior race of all, and there is quite a violent history associated with this group. Even many famous and well-known people have been allegedly associated with the Ku Klux Klan, and they were known for their acute atrocity and acute neglect of black freedom, or even considering the blacks to be humans. But then again, as the history of American slavery shows, any white American, he or she did not consider the black to be human at all. The history of the blacks, or the history of African Americans, is basically a history of dehumanization, which they tried to break through, and could eventually, when Harlem Renaissance came to be and the artists took out, or artists use other forms of creativity other than pamphlet writing, other than political writing, which up till now black reformists were adhering to, were going to as their form of revolutions. With the Harlem Renaissance, people started composing fictions which allegorically symbolized the black oppression. So that was the true time of high American creation of art, even though I would not say that before that it did not exist. So there was also the segregation and the Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow, a very brief background to what the Jim Crow is. Well, a Jim Crow is an image. We will talk about this image of Jim Crow, the image of the black face, later on when we study the issue of race in the novel. Even though the issue of race is pervasive in all of the issues that we study, specifically race will be a crucial point. However, we will be dedicating a couple of classes particularly to the issue of race, and discussing the various facets of the racial condition which the novel depicts, which the novel tries to portray to us in a different sort of a way. Well, Jim Crow is an image of the black slave who is a clown. He's scrawny, he's very thin, he's tall, he wears ragged and tattered clothes, patched up clothes, he has a hat, and that is what it's a derogatory phrase. You can understand it's a derogatory phrase that had been used to insult or to negotiate the inferior standard to which the blacks belonged, according to the white Americans, according to the whites. There was also the sanctioning of the black family. The blacks, they were not allowed to marry. Marriage was not a recognized form of institution among the blacks. Recognition which was given by the whites in order to authenticate the marriage. There were no churches for the blacks, so therefore there was no religious authentication of the marriage as well. They were not allowed congregations, they were not allowed to go to mass, they were not allowed to pray in a group under a steepled church. And this was the condition, this was the culture that was prevalent in America in the 19th century. And whereas on the other hand, in the European counterpart, as the British sun started to set, as England started to profusely lose, in a butterfly effect, it started to lose its position as the supreme colonialist. It started to lose its colonies. Many colonies were attaining independence through battles, through wars, or through mutual understanding. So the condition in the European counterpart, that is the West, that was it was such that people were incessantly migrating to the new West. They were incessantly migrating to America in search of work, because it was the new land which required farmers, which required workers, and therefore Europeans were migrating mostly to South America in search of work. If you read Thomas Hardy's novel Tess of the D'Urbervilles, you will find that there is a section where we come across advertisements put up by American farmholders, and they promised work and progress to the prospective migrants. And we also have a character within the novel, a protagonist within the novel, called Angel, who goes to Brazil in search of work, tries to build his life, tries to build his career as an agriculturalist, as a progressive farmer. He was a learned man, he was an educated individual, and he migrates to Brazil in search of work. But what he finds and what he experiences is nothing other than disease, and nothing other than the oppressed or the depressed conditions in which the workers were kept, thereby curbing the way, thereby putting a constriction in the way of also coming out of the disease. So there was no way in which that disease, metaphoric and also physical, could be done away with, because the conditions, they were not improved. They were deliberately kept in the same condition of the disease, so that it can perpetuate itself, so that they can remain weak. And so, like Tess's husband, Angel, who moves to Brazil with the hope of a new beginning, its advertisement in the novel coincides with and also symbolizes the period of immigration, which had reached its peak in those years, in the early 19th or in the mid 19th century. As Henry David Thoreau writes about, he describes the New England workers and says that the New England workers were living in sties. I had mentioned this before. They were living in sties, and all winter with an open door for the sake of light, without any visible, often imaginable woodpile, and the forms of both old and young were permanently contracted by the long habit of shrinking from cold and misery, and the development of all their limbs and faculties is checked. In another place, it's written that this picture of destitution against the backdrop of increasing national wealth was striking. One resident wrote that in our good city of New York, the two extremes of costly luxury and living, expensive establishments, and improvident waste are presented in daily and hourly contrast with squalid misery and hopeless destitution. So America was now a land of striking contradiction, because as it progressed, as it became more interconnected with new transportation facilities being built, it also shrank in distance. The idea of America grew in size, whereas America as a place, as a geographical land, it shrank in size. It facilitated trade, it facilitated transportation of slaves and of materials, and it boomed business. Historians record that it was because of the absence of sewage systems, clean water, systematic street cleaning, pure food and milk, and effective methods for preserving and freezing meats that diseases like diphtheria, whooping cough, fevers, and flu remained as recurring threats to people, but especially babies and young children in the filthy cities. Congested urban conditions also made tuberculosis one of the commonest and most feared afflictions till about the middle of the century, primarily because of its symptoms of coughing and spitting. This disease was one of the major factors for the animosity towards new and poor immigrants, though religious factors also came to be considered, and illness were often seen as a punishment for failing to keep to certain standards of morality. So if you are suffering from a disease, and if you happen to be a native or a poor immigrant or a black, then it was your fault that you are suffering for the disease. The idea was that it was your fault because that you were suffering with the disease, that you are in disease, that you are ill, because you failed to stand up to the moral standards that were set by the white Americans. The dislike of Catholic immigrants like the Irish who faced severe nativist assaults found several outlets, not least in employment, where employers sometimes even declared that no Irish need apply. So the racism in America, it extended to other races as well, not just people who were black in color. Now, this was also the time of American Renaissance, or to be more precise, it's interchangeable correctly, American Romanticism, the 19th century American Romanticism. It was also the time of American Renaissance, as I said, because this was the time when Americans were starting to build a new literary culture of themselves, free from Eurocentric perspectives. They were trying to build up an individual image of America, which eventually gave rise, to the American dream, the concept of the American dream, where the land will, which states, or which entails, the dream entails that the land of America will provide equal opportunity to anyone who is willing to put an effort, who is willing to work hard. So it does not depend upon your religion or your race or your color or your creed or your political affiliations. If you are a hard worker, your dream will be fulfilled, and that is the American dream. And it is true that America is a country which is progressive, which is liberal, and which is the most sought after countries for making a good life, if I can say, because of this notion of American dream, upon which the foundation upon which this nation was built, that the land sees no margins, that the land sees no divisions, and it will provide equal opportunity to any hard worker. So this idea of the vastness of the new land resulted in the romanticization and exploitation, in literature, and both in literature and culture. Now, this American Romanticism was also problematic, as it produced a negative impact upon the culture of slavery. American Romanticism was an arts and literature movement that began in Europe and eventually made its way to the United States. Initially, Romanticism sparked as a reaction to industrialization and the restrictive neoclassical ideas of the preceding age of enlightenment, the age which was based on rationality, which was based on morality, rather than individual freedom, rather than self-expression. So it was restrictive, and American Romanticism came as a reaction to the previous era's restrictions. It was the first real literary movement ever to occur in the United States. It was known as the American Renaissance because it was around this time that American writers and artists began searching for a distinctly American voice, separate from that of their British and European counterparts. Just a short decades after the American Revolution and in the wake of the War of 1812, the country found itself in a place of newly acquired freedom and at the precipice of unending possibility with regards to their identity as a nation. This resulted in a burst of creative activity and artistic development spanning from early to mid 1800s. So there were people like Henry David Thoreau, there were people like Walt Whitman, who were contributing or who were the major propounders of American Romanticism, of American Renaissance. And it was also the time where Andrew Jackson shaped the democratic thought and concept, asserting the value of individual no matter their background or social status. Influenced by this increase in democratic ideal, American culture began to lead more toward individualism, compounding or amalgamating within itself the already existing romantic ideas of self-expression and independence. So we have writers such as Ralph Waldo Emerson. We have writers such as Nathaniel Hawthorne, on the other hand, who would go on to write Gothic fiction, as a symbolic way to contradict or to provide the contrasting structure of the American society, wherein there is a dark truth lying behind the reality that we see in front of us. Gothic literature, American Gothic literature was a source of writers, was a source for writers to vent out this contradiction in fiction. Now this American individualism, which came to the forefront with the American Romanticism, wherein romance, as in the old genre of romance, not love story, but such as the Arthurian romances, where there will be protagonists will be undertaking a quest in search for some kind of truth. So in this case, it is the search for the self, and therefore we have Whitman's poetry, and therefore we have W.E.B. Du Bois writing for the American scholar. We have Emerson writing the American scholar. We have W.E.B. Du Bois writing for this black individualism. We will talk about that. So this American Romanticism also gave rise to the idea of the self. Now this created a problem when it comes to the culture of slavery in America, because the literature which was thus produced was one that included stories of challenges that one would inevitably have to face during the journey, giving rise to a larger than life characters. Journey through the land. It gave rise to larger than life characters and introduced the newly defined genre of the romance. This genre rose with the base of the natural background that required extraordinary human courage and endurance, which was frequently characterized by the protagonist's encounter with an other. So it is the self that is undertaking the journey, this self being the priority, this self being the white American, and this self would undertake a journey trying to conquer the topography of America, of this new land. We can have numerous feminist interpretations over here, land being feminine and the protagonist more or less always being masculine character. So but keeping that aside, so the self is the one who is the protagonist, the self is the white American who undertakes a journey, and he encounters an other. Who is this other? This other depends upon the land. So if it is the land of India, this other would be the Indians. So in America, this other is the black African American or the black slave, particularly in adventures in the novel in Huckleberry Finn. Now this other is someone who is not the self. This other is a completely different individual, completely different person. The self is of course the priority over here. The other comes in the face of an encounter, and the self and the other, they meet, and there is an interaction, there is a communication, there are incidents, there are conversations, there are adventures, there are misadventures, and there is a journey that the two take together, like the novel that we have at hand, like Huck and Jim. They do take an adventure together on the raft over the river of Mississippi. Now, what is important to understand over here is the concept of the other. Now, the very name other, that is the other, is someone that is defined from the perspective of the self. It is the self that decides who and what forms the other. So if the self is the white American individual and it sees, who would it see as its other? Of course, someone who stands in complete binary opposite to him, to the white American individualism, to the white American culture that dehumanizes slave, that sees it as a normal system of work and justifies it, authenticates it, perpetuates it in order to increase profit, in order to maintain this falsified concept of racial superiority. This other is always defined by the self. And here also we find Jim being defined and described and explained, justified, authenticated, rejected, accepted by Huck, who is the self. But in this case, in particularly in Huckleberry Finn's case, this is not such a binary dichotomy, because the protagonist that we have at hand over here is, as I have already mentioned in the past, that the protagonist that we have over here does not belong to the upper class society. He is not a slaver. He does not own slaves. Neither did his father. His father was a drunkard, and he was taken by the church. He was adopted by the church, and then by a family who tried to give him education, from which he constantly tried to run away. And the only time in which he settled down and he tried to acquire the culture which this family was trying to give him. He was trying to go to school, he was becoming a regular in school. His drunkard father returns and takes him back to that impoverished condition and the brutal condition in which he used to live with his father. He used to hit him, who is an incessant drunkard, who does not have any moral values, and who also tries to take away the grant money which the church had given to Huck as a result of his poverty, which you will learn if you read The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which is a novel that precedes this Huckleberry Finn, and it is in a sort of prequel, and because it is there that we are introduced to Huckleberry Finn for the first time. And in this novel, Huckleberry Finn, his adventures are continued, are a continuation from the previous novel. So we do learn about his family in that novel, the very impoverished and the poor conditions in which he belongs. So he belongs to the lowest rung of the social structure. He is not powerful. He is a powerless adolescent boy who is trying to run away from his drunkard father, who is trying to run away from a society that continuously tries to tame him, even though he does not want to. And he is a forever adolescent boy. He does not grow up, technically throughout the novel. He's like that forever eternal adolescent boy of the Araby, who needs to stay in that age in order to remain true to his perspectives, which of course change as you grow up. So Huck's position as the self is quite problematic, And here in what I would like to introduce to you is the theory or the concept of double consciousness. Now, double consciousness is a concept introduced by W.E.B. Du Bois in his book, The Souls of Black Folk. It is a beautiful name that he has given to his book, because here he talks about not the body of the black folk, not the color and its own problems, but the soul of the black folk and how to regenerate it. So, double consciousness is essentially a study of otherization, of how the black becomes the other of the white self. Throughout generations, through years and years of oppression, this black slave has constantly been defined by its owner, by his or her master or mistress. He or she, the slave, has been told what to do, what not to do, how to eat, what to eat, where to live, not to marry, not to pray, not to eat more, not to clean the body. It has constantly been oppressed. It has constantly been taught and made to think that the condition in which he or she is living, the slave is living, is something that he or she deserves, is something that is right, and something that is laid down by providence. So this slave's own consciousness slowly fades into a black abyss, into an abyss from which it cannot return. The consciousness is strewn with, it is adulterated with white American slaving sanctions, the oppression. It is its own, the slave's own culture, the African Americans' own culture, the African Americans' own history, the African Americans' own humanity, its own thought process is constantly hindered, it's constantly paused and adulterated and substituted by the degenerative culture of the white American. That is how the slave is otherized. That is how the slave is made to think that whatever is happening to him is the correct way. But at the same point of time, he knows, the slave knows, that what is happening to him cannot be something that is right, that it needs to come out of this misery, that it needs to come out of this perpetually enslaving conditions in which generations of African Americans have been treated as slaves and passed on as property, as furniture, as non-living things, never as human beings. So the other's consciousness is strewn it's full of, it is adulterated by the narrative of the white American. But when we come to Huck, his position as a self is a bit problematic. Here we can establish something, that Rhett S. Jones calls the white double consciousness. So what Du Bois states in the passage that you just saw in the previous slide is a bit contradictory. He first observes that blacks have no true self-consciousness and then implies that they have a consciousness of themselves that differs from the white perspective on blacks. But the quote that you saw is one very frequently quoted passages of the book, The Souls of Black Folk. And it has been recognized and has been accepted, the idea that black folks are able to view themselves now through the eyes of whites and now through the eyes of blacks. There appears, however, that there has been some little scholarship or little study in how the structure of the American society at that point of time had produced a white double consciousness as well. So just as black people view themselves from two different perspectives, so too have white people long viewed Afro-Americans in two different ways. From the beginning of slavery in North America, it was to the economic and financial advantage of the Euro-Americans to define persons of African descent, that is the blacks, that is the African descent people. If they were not seen as animals by the white Americans, then at least as something less than full members of the human race. A perspective which enabled whites to barter and sell human beings both in Africa and America without any sort of a conscience. While this viewpoint dominated the public arena and was supported by theologians, scientists, politicians, and philosophers, it never fully persuaded the mass of white Americans, who, of course, very frequently left their children in the care of the black nanny, or mammy as they were called. The stereotype of the mammy itself contradicted the idea that black people were incapable of thought and caring. So they were human beings after all. After all, only a fool would turn her children over to the care of an animal, and white people did not count themselves fools. Of course, they were the superior race. The essence of white double consciousness then is therefore to be found in the different contradictory viewpoints Euro-Americans hold of Afro-Americans. Despite the resources invested by whites in proving to one another that black folk were not human, they never fully convinced one another. Writing in early years of 19th century, David Walker observes that despite all the racist rhetorics of whites, there is a secret monitor in their hearts which tells them blacks are human. Whites have never been able to escape knowledge of black humanity. But given their hegemony, given their desire or drive to perpetuate the power, they have been able to create a corpus of racist thought which defines blacks as inferior. Euro-Americans have moved back and forth between their two perspectives on Africanity, now seeing blacks as less than human, now recognizing their membership in the family of man. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, by one of the nation's most distinguished authors, reflects and embodies this white double consciousness, as Mark Twain shifts back and forth in his perspective on Jim and other blacks, now viewing them as full-fledged human beings, now regarding them as an inferior folk. Twain lived and wrote at the pinnacle, at the apogee, at the peak of racist thought in the US, in the United States. During his lifetime, justifications for the enslavement, hatred, and exploitation of black and other colored peoples were given a final polish. The machine gun wiped out the last stubborn packets of non-white resistance to white imperialism, forcing not only the Apache, the Comanche of America's Southwest, that is the few tribal communities that I named Southwest, finally to accept white dominance, they did, but also the other tribes of Ashanti of Ghana, the Araucanians of Chile, and colored peoples around the globe to accept white rule. The British fought and won over a war which enabled them to force the Chinese government to allow opium into China, and were soon to boast that the sun never set on the British Empire. the governments of Europe solemnly met and divided up Africa. Twain himself joined a Confederate militia unit, thereby offering his services to a government dedicated to maintaining the only slave system in North America. Rayford W. Logan described the period between 1877 and 1901, during which time Twain's books won him a large following as the nadir in history of Afro-Americans. As I have already mentioned, this was also the time when Ku Klux Klan reached its height during this era, and lynchings, lit up in fire, alive, lynchings of blacks became commonplace. The maltreatment of blacks in the 19th century, first under slavery and later under the rule of Jim Crow, that is segregation laws, was publicly endorsed by every major institution in the nation. As the churches found biblical justifications for it, the courts repeatedly ruled African Americans were not entitled to the protection of the Constitution. They were not citizens. Remember the Dred Scott decision. And businesses refused to employ blacks in any but the most menial capacities. Before Twain died, the newly emergent social sciences devised a number of ways to prove the inferiority of the black folk. Despite these public quote-unquote proofs, repeatedly and often presented by powerful men in every walk of life, most whites were not able to escape knowledge of black humanity. To fully understand the white double consciousness, it is required to understand that in the US, or precisely the 13 British colonies which preceded the land of America, mixed races were not recognized. In all the other Western counterparts, mixed races were recognized. There were mulattoes, there were mestis, there were zambos, which were terms given to offsprings of whites and blacks, of whites and other races. But in the United States particularly, this was not recognized. In the other places it was legalized. It was mentioned in legal documents, thus proving that the mixed races were recognized. And the mixed races, they had a better way of freeing themselves from the restrictions of racism and slavery, because they rode up the racial ladder by mingling with the superior race of the whites. But in America, there was a strict isolation that was followed. The white Americans, they did not mingle with the blacks. There was no social recognition of the mixed races. The children were killed. In so many movies, if you find, there is, of course, the black female, they were raped. They were forcibly, commanded under sexual authority. And of course, there were children. Nobody cared, for an abortion. Nobody cared for in which condition the black slave woman is giving birth to. But the children, they were not recognized. They were not legalized. So there was no way of escape even for that mixed generation of an offspring of the white and the black. So in contrast to the rest of the Americas, the United States established a public fiction which denied sexual and social contact among the races. The term mestizo, which is applied to the persons of mixed European and Native American ancestry in Mexico, Central America, and other parts of the Spanish-speaking Americas, has no counterpart in the US. Mexico now celebrates itself as a mestizo nation, a country influenced by the best of Native American and European culture. In the US, sexual relationships between Indians and whites are instead said to culminate in the birth of half-breeds, who are, according to popular stereotype, dirty, drunken, and degenerate persons. The public fiction of racial purity facilitated the structural isolation of the races in the United States. The absence of such terms, as I mentioned, like mulatto, zambo, mestizo, widens the gap among the races. suggests that there has never been any meaningful contact among them, and that each is therefore most comfortable in its own separate, segregated place. Admitting the existence of persons of mixed racial ancestry would force Euro-Americans who benefit from the present system to raise questions about not only their ancestry but also about the humanity of the non-white peoples. Twain wrote in the midst of this structural isolation. At one level, the novel Huckleberry Finn simply reflects the public racial fiction of his time, which I just mentioned. Whites, blacks, and Indians all receive mention in the book, and there is seemingly in neither Twain's mind nor Huck's any doubt that they are three distinct people. There is nothing to suggest any meaningful contact among them in Huck's reflections, as he accepts the white version of the meaning of blackness, that is, the otherized black, the slave, the inhuman black, the diseased black. But at another level, Huck repeatedly encounters Jim under circumstances in which he is forced to acknowledge Jim's humanity. Huck manifests white double consciousness as he shifts back and forth between his own regard for Jim as a person and the kind of person the society tells him that Jim must be. Huck and Jim lived in a period when whites in the United States largely controlled blacks by means of slavery and by making the slaves stand in fear. That is it, fear. In contrast, whites in the Ibero-Americas, other parts of America, early devised means for controlling blacks other than slavery. By the time Brazil formally abolished slavery, 3/4 of that nation's black population were already free, although they remained subordinate to whites. Moreover, while Latin American whites had learned how to hide behind the corporate structures of church and state while exercising racial power, slavery in the US was not only the central means of controlling the blacks until the Civil War, but rested on intimate personal relationships. The North American slave was beaten, tortured, overworked, and maltreated not by some impersonal institution which administered estates on which hundreds of slaves labored, but by a single individual, his master, who more often than not owned only a few slaves and knew each one by name. Unlike the large plantations of Latin America, slavery in the US was up close, face to face, is pro bono, personal and intimate. Most slave owners held only a few slaves and knew them very well. In their day-to-day interactions with their black property, slave masters acknowledged. In their day-to-day interactions with their black property, that is the slaves, slave masters acknowledged black humanity, but publicly denied that Afro-Americans were human. This is the public fiction that is being created. Although Huck is not a slaveholder, he seldom criticizes the system which rationalized slavery. Yet he knows Jim and knows that Jim ill fits the stereotype of the ignorant darky. As the raft moves down the river, Huck shifts uneasily between the two layers of white double consciousness. Now Jim is a person, now he is a nigger. So in denying Jim's humanity, Huck has the entire arsenal of the 19th century American culture on his side. This culture was organized so as to prevent whites from seeing how blacks suffered and constructed so as to separate blacks from whites. When slave mothers wept as their children were sold away from them, the culture comforted white America or the white Americans by insisting that while the mothers seemed to be miserable, to be very crude, they were very much like bitches deprived of their pups. The dog might miss them for a few days, but soon forgot her puppies. This was the culture that was prevalent, because Euro-Americans, whether slaveholders or not, knew that black women were not bitches. They were far from convinced by such arguments, but at the same time they wanted to be convinced. Whites also knew, given the intimate association between the races, much about black life. While the structural isolation of the races provided whites with ready-to-hand explanations for the maltreatment of black folk, it did not fully prevent them from perceiving black suffering. But the culture itself, by insisting that blacks were a lesser breed of mankind, enabled whites to live comfortably with the knowledge of the pain of Afro-Americans. The public level of white double consciousness, the level supported by culture and powerful institutions alike, helped Euro-Americans avoid reflecting on the conditions which produced black suffering. So when Jim meets Huck on Jackson's Island, the fugitive explains that he fled his mistress because she was considering the possibility of selling him down river to New Orleans. We find this in chapter 8. Now, as I mentioned the chapters, it's very important that you note them down because you can understand those are the important chapters. Huck clearly understands that blacks in misery feared being sold down river as they believed slavery became ever more harsh as one moved to south, and it was true. When Huck later encounters other characters, the other characters of Duke and the King who question him as to whether Jim might be a runaway slave, Huck replies, "Goodness sakes, would a runaway nigger run south?" This answer satisfies the Scalaways, that is Duke and the King, as they too share the general white knowledge of the border state blacks' fear of the deep south. Huck knows this fear, but he does not spend much time in thinking about it. And for an adventuresome, insightful boy, as quick with a lie, he is very quick to lie as his pap was with a bottle, Huck is curiously unable to come up with a plan that will enable Jim to move north rather than deeper into the south. Tom Sawyer, presumably every bit as knowledgeable as Huck, the Duke and the King of this black fear, had planned to take Jim all the way down to the mouth of the Mississippi, having adventures all the way. Tom lacks the intimate knowledge of Jim that Huck has gained, but the two boys are equally indifferent to the fugitive's fear and feelings. Now, one of the ways in which whites avoided confrontation with the humanity of black folk was to see themselves as kind to Afro-Americans, thereby focusing on their feeling of being good, decent people rather than on the feelings of enslaved blacks. This technique did not prevent white awareness of black suffering. That is, it did not prevent white double consciousness, but instead enabled Euro-Americans to drown out the human cries of black folk. According to Huck, Jim tells the two boys that there is another character in the novel, Uncle Silas, who comes to him every day or two to pray with him, and Aunt Sally, another character, comes in to see if he was comfortable and had plenty to eat, and both of them was kind as could be. This is what Jim says about two white slave owners. But Jim does not say that these people, that is the Phelpses, the Phelps farm, towards the end of the novel we find Jim and Huck and Tom all estranged in the Phelpses farm. So as I was saying, Jim does not say that the Phelpses, who are repeatedly described by Huck as good, gentle, loving people, contemplated doing anything other than returning him to the owner. Because Aunt Sally was not so kind as to release the fugitive, nor is there any evidence that either of them ever asked Jim about his family or his life. There is also reason to question how kind they were to Jim. Huck, although he finds Jim chained to a bed, does everything possible to present his captivity as a comfortable one. And yet there are little indications that Huck has seen in the kind treatment the Phelpses gave the runaway only what he wants to see. Tom Sawyer asks Huck to raise a flower in the cabin in which Jim is chained or Jim is kept. Jim is confined, but the bondsman replies this will be difficult as the cabin does not get enough sunlight to make it possible to grow a flower. Did the kind Phelpses in their regular visits to pray with Jim not notice how dark the cabin was? Or if they noticed, did they just not care? The Phelpses take the fact that Jim is chained to a bed in a dark cabin for granted. The structural isolation of the races so characteristic of the time and the time of Twain himself, where Twain lived and wrote, prevented them from fully acknowledging Jim's humanity. In their case, white double consciousness is truncated. The Phelpses, they visit Jim frequently, but he remains for them simply a runaway nigger whom they are obliged to return to his rightful owner. In Huck, this white double consciousness is more fully developed as one who is marginal to Euro-American society. Of course he is. Huck has a healthy suspicion of the culture which governs it, and he frequently reflects on the willingness of most whites to break the rules when it is to their interest. So he accepts that. Unlike the Phelpses, he sees things as they really are. So that when Tom proposes that Huck steal a slave girl's dress as part of the elaborate plot to help Jim escape, Huck frankly replies, "Why, Tom, that will make a trouble next morning, because of course she probably haven't got any but that one." Huck, in attempting to bring Tom back to reality and to persuade him to simplify the escape plot, forces reality on his friend by insisting that stealing the only dress of a slave is bound to draw attention to the plan. Tom, however, proves persuasive and Huck steals the dress. But he has already demonstrated that he understands and acknowledges the deprivation to which blacks were subjected, even on a small plantation run by such so-called benevolent people as the Phelpses. Because Huck also owns just one pair of pants. He is not powerful, he is marginal. So that puts him in the most accurate position to recognize and acknowledge the mirrored condition in which his black counterpart, his black other, was living in, as that race was living in. Much of the critical literature assigns Jim too large a role in changing Huck's attitude towards the blacks. Although it is true that the intimate association between the black man and the white boy as the raft drifts southwards has been an impact on Huck's ideas. But even before Huck encounters Jim on Jackson's Island, he is already an unconventional lad, accustomed to thinking for himself. His experiences with Jim merely sharpens his awareness of the contradictions of white double consciousness as he moves back and forth between the public position on blackness and his own personal opinions and conclusions. Huck finds much to admire in Jim. He has any boy's admiration for the adult male who displays manual dexterity, knowledge of the physical world, and the ability to master inanimate objects. Huck describes with enthusiasm the improvements Jim makes on the raft. Although he is white, Huck is after all only a boy who has learned much on his own. The instructions offered by Pap have seldom been systematic or even coherent, and he admires Jim's technical knowledge. But so, too, did most slaveholders of the time, who often publicly praised the physical achievements and manual dexterity of the slaves. Huck goes beyond them, however, in recognizing Jim's humanity. Most whites knew blacks were human beings, but well understood that to admit this fact would undercut not only slavery, but also white hegemony. In Huck's time, in Twain's time, and in the present, whites are frequently unwilling to acknowledge black humanity, as I have quoted on the screen. But Huck had little power and was dependent upon Jim to help him escape the triple tyranny of the community, which tried to tame him, which tried to so-called civilize him, which tried to educate him in their own education, in the civilization which they thought correct, which of course Huck's own white double consciousness prevented him from fully acknowledging as the only truth. The triple tyranny of the community, of the widow, that is the family that had adopted adopted Huck, the widow would constantly try to send him to school, constantly try to Catholicize him, constantly try to educate him, mostly in religion, and also from his escape from his drunkard father or pap. It is Jim who knows how to build a platform on a raft so as to keep their possessions dry. It is Jim who is knowledgeable of the customs of the river. And it is Jim who is able to establish connections between the behavior of animals and the actions of human beings. The two drifters need one another. Jim needs Huck's white skin and his ready quickness with a lie, while Huck needs the sure confidence Jim has in his own skills and the insight the runaway has into human behavior. White double consciousness thus was born of the awareness of Euro-Americans of their dependence on their slaves and of their awareness almost never publicly acknowledged, that without Afro-American labor and intelligence, America would have been a very different and lesser place. The important difference between Huck and the mass of his fellow white Americans is to be found not only in his shrewd suspicion of the self-serving public pronouncements, but also in acknowledged need for Jim. Huck's youth and his dependence on Jim reverse the usual relationship between whites and blacks in the United States, as ordinarily it is blacks who are watchfully observant of whites, shrewdly calculating their moods and preparing to act in ways that will enable them to survive. The black double consciousness of which Du Bois writes reflects this watchful reflectivity, but Huck needs Jim, and because he is already a boy who peers beneath the surface, the lowest class of the American society, seeking to discern the workings below, Huck watches Jim, and in the course of his observations reaches conclusions about the fugitive, which ill-fit public pronouncements of blackness. Huck finds Jim not to be dull, dumb, brute, but a sensitive human being. And therefore, he says, as in the quote you can see in chapter 23, that I do believe he cared just as much for his people as white folks did. Huck's recognition of Jim's humanity is manifested in three ways. First, there is a game they play with each other, in which Jim waits until he believes Huck is asleep before he gives vent to his sense of loss at being separated from his wife and children. As an adult, he realizes there are feelings. These are feelings Huck, whose own family consists solely on the cruel drunken pap, Huck cannot understand nor, more importantly, do anything about it. As a boy himself, even though he is a white boy, there is nothing Huck can do to reunite a black family. That's true. That's quite a practical approach. As a boy himself, he cannot do anything about it. Moreover, Jim has every reason to believe that Huck is already uneasy in helping him to escape, so that the likelihood that the youngster will do anything to help Jim's family get out of bondage is remote, is farthest away. Second, Huck, in his watchful observation of Jim, is aware of the fact that Jim intends to spare him his agony. That is a beautiful relationship that they share. Finally, Huck recounts at some length Jim's story in which the slave berates himself for striking his 4-year-old daughter. This also happens in chapter 23, who had become deaf without his realizing it. It is difficult to imagine the Phelpses, for example, the farm in which they were estranged in the final parts of the novel. It is difficult to imagine the Phelpses, for example, appreciating Jim's anger at himself. Huck does not quiz Jim, he does not question Jim, but watches him carefully and comes to understand that the runaway slave does indeed love his family, much as any white person might. And among the more interesting aspects of the relationship that these two share is what Huck learns of black life beyond Jim as a result of their association. The double consciousness of Euro-Americans made them not only aware of the existence of a black life on the other side of the wall racism had built, but suspicious and fearful of black plots On the one hand, whites wished to believe that blacks were incapable of laying plans to attack whites. On the other hand, as David Walker described, which I also mentioned in the beginning of the class, their secret monitor made them conscious of black cooperation and resistance, which we also find an example of in chapter 18 of the novel, when after Jim and Huck are separated, Huck takes up what turns out to be a temporary residence with the Grangerfords, a family. A Grangerford slave, Jack, leads Huck to where Jim is hiding. Jim explains that he hid in the woods, waiting for the opportunity to make contact with Huck. But he says that early in the morning, some niggers came along, going to the fields, and they took Jim and showed him the place, which the dogs cannot track on account of the water. And these niggers, they help Jim hide. Huck shows no surprise because he realizes that just as the whites conjugated together and grouped together in order to perpetuate slavery and to keep enslavement intact, the blacks also unite together in order to resist the system of slavery. So Huck is neither threatened nor frightened, by this knowledge, in large part because while his own experience with Jim leads him to reject the public fiction, which made up one layer of white double consciousness, these same experiences leave others intact. Huck really believes Jim loves him, and while most whites do not go so far as to believe that blacks love them, they find it difficult to acknowledge that Afro-Americans hate them. For in order to do so, they would have to accept first that they have done things to blacks that will make them deserving of the hatred, and second, that blacks are sufficiently like themselves as to return white hatred of blacks with black hatred of whites. So the whites, they did not believe that the blacks could reciprocate the inhuman conditions in which they were kept, in which they were enslaved by the white Americans. The 1960s, a time in which many black Americans publicly stated for the first time their hate for the whites, was an era of rude awakening for many Euro-Americans. But in the era in which Twain lived and wrote, and in the time frame in which he places Huck, few whites were prepared to accept the idea that blacks might hate them. Huck believes himself loved. After escaping from the Grangerford's farm, there was a battle that took place in that farm between the family of Grangerfords and the shepherd's sons. When they escape, Huck rejoins Jim by running along the river bank and jumping aboard the raft, where Jim grabbed me. So, I'm quoting, Jim grabbed me and hugged me. He was so glad to see me. Whenever Huck and Jim meet after a separation, Huck emphasizes how glad Jim is to see him and how much Jim loves him. The boy is not therefore frightened by his knowledge of the black cooperation, because he believes that blacks have so much love for whites that they will do them no serious harm. This attitude is maintained despite Huck's knowledge of the terrible things whites do to the black. Moreover, Huck, as is the case of most Euro-Americans of his time, wants to believe that not only does Jim love him, but that the fugitive slave acknowledges the superiority of the black folk. After listening to Tom's elaborate plot for Jim's escape from the Phelps' farm in the last chapter 36, he says Jim, he couldn't see no sense in most of it, but he allowed we was white folks and knowed better than him. So he was satisfied and said he would do it all just as Tom said. The two factors taken together, that is the belief that blacks loved the whites and the belief that the blacks accepted the idea that the whites were in fact superior. The first made whites comfortable. These two ideas taken together firstly made the whites comfortable at the social level. Huck, after all, does not fear attack by Jim or other black Americans because they love and admire white Americans. Second, these two beliefs make whites comfortable at the psychological level, as they need feel no guilt for what they say about Afro Americans or do to them. Some scholars have suggested blacks pretended to accept these beliefs in order to manipulate and influence white folk. Whether or not this hypothesis is correct, Twain clearly believes blacks admired, accepted, and loved whites, and has Huck say so. Now let's continue this in the next class.